Minasan konnichiwa, Ali desu. Hi everyone, my name is Ali. Welcome or welcome back to the channel. Today we're doing a very exciting video because I'm gonna be telling you all about the past mistakes that I've made in my listening immersion practice for language learning. With this video, we're kicking off yet again a new series on the channel where I'm going to be sharing with you all of the past mistakes that I've made with my language learning. I've been studying languages and properly acquiring languages for about 13 years now, ever since I was out of high school basically and I was left to my own devices. And during those 13 years, I have acquired two languages, English and Japanese. I have maintained my German from my high school classes, and I am now learning Mandarin Chinese and Russian. And on top of that, I've actually been coaching lots of language learners online, a little over 100 people since 2021. So based on this experience, I am now, I believe, able to share more about where I think I've made some mistakes in the past with my language learning and how I have corrected them. And so today's topic is going to be listening immersion practice. Past mistake number one, not starting my listening immersion practice from day one. This is definitely a mistake that I wish I'd avoided when I started learning Japanese back in 2019, because essentially for the whole first year of my studying of the language, I did not do any listening immersion practice. And at the time, I just thought to myself that this was not the right moment, that I was still too much of a beginner, that I wouldn't understand anything anyway, and that it wouldn't give me any sort of benefits. And I can tell you now in retrospect that I was entirely wrong, and I bitterly regretted that later on in my study journey of the language. And essentially starting from the end of 2019, when I realized my mistake, since I wasn't able to understand anything said in the language, even the shortest, simplest sentences, simplest words, not even talking about sentences. I wasn't able to understand anything spoken in the language, which was a problem that I could have easily prevented had I had the courage to start listening immersion practice from day one. And again, in retrospect now, I can tell you that this was a mistake because I've also experienced starting a new language, starting to study a new language, and also starting my listening immersion practice from day one. I've done that since then. I've done that with Mandarin Chinese and Russian, and I can tell you for sure that thanks to me doing that, I have been enjoying the study process for those two languages much more, and I have avoided this trap that I had set for myself with Japanese, and that I spent months after that to correct, actually. And as for the fear that I had of not being able to understand anything during the beginner stage, I mean, I still vividly remember what my thought process was back then, and I do understand the fear very much, and I see a lot of people who have the same kind of fear, but I'm here to tell you that, in fact, there's nothing to fear, and especially when you do listening practice on your own, since there isn't a native speaker in front of you who expects you to understand everything that they say and then you to respond back. You do not need to understand everything at all. The only thing you need to be concerned about at this stage of your learning, right at the beginner stage, really from day zero, from day one, is to listen to the spoken language enough for you to become familiar with it. No one expects you to understand anything, and you should definitely not put this kind of pressure on yourself. Just enjoy listening to the language and just enjoy the flow, really. Before you know it, you will actually be able to pick up some words more and more, and then increasingly until you understand everything that's being said. So really, it's only a fun process. Now I realize this. It's really only a fun process. So enjoy it for what it is, without any pressure. Alright, past mistake number two, relying too much on foreigner-friendly audio. Or I could have said, relying too much on textbook audio or language exam audio, anything that's basically created for non-native speakers. It's a trap that I wasn't aware of at all when I started learning Japanese, simply because it was my first time actually really properly learning a language on my own from scratch, from the start, because with English it was obviously very different since I acquired the basics when I was still at high school. With Japanese, when I first started doing listening immersion practice, I felt like I needed to go to YouTube channels that were made for Japanese learners, or essentially anything that's made for people who learn the language. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you should not use those. You should definitely use those. There are some great ones out there. However, you cannot only rely on those. You really, really, really need to strike a balance, a good balance between the amount of resources you use that are made for foreigners studying the language, whatever language it is, and resources made by native speakers for native speakers. So any content that you can find online, essentially. Nowadays, it's so easy to come across, that kind of content. Just make sure you have that in mind, because definitely, once again, this was a past mistake of mine, and I bitterly regretted it. When I had this moment of realization, that's great, I can understand the JLPT audio. Great, this is not natural speech at all. And then when you're confronted to any sort of real content, it's not pleasant. Again, when I realized this, I bitterly regretted focusing only on audio in the language that was made for learners of the language. Mistake number 3, not doing listening immersion enough or trying to do too much. So this mistake is very linked to Japanese once again, because I feel like I experienced a lot of mistakes when I first started learning Japanese, and I consistently made mistakes when learning the language for the first 3 years, and then finally it started to click for me. Now, again, in retrospect, I can tell you that with Japanese, there were lots of periods in which I didn't do enough listening immersion, and I bitterly regretted it. The entire first year of my learning Japanese, which was 2019, and then any period in which I was preparing for the JLPT exams, especially N2 and N1, very intensively. During those periods, I was much more focused on textbooks and preparation books and apps that I was using for my preparation, and so it left little time for me, I left little time for me to actually do more listening immersion practice, which I think impacted me later. So I'm definitely mindful of that now with Mandarin Chinese and with Russian, even though right now I'm not studying Russian, I'm on break from Russian. But with Mandarin Chinese, I'm definitely mindful of that. And I make sure that at least half of my study time with the language is in audio form, that I'm listening to the language. Even if I don't understand everything, I'm far from understanding everything in Mandarin Chinese at the moment, but I don't care, I don't mind, because now I know that it's part of the process and I really need to go through this phase. So these were the periods in which I did not do enough listening immersion practice, and then again I regretted it a lot afterwards, because I struggled, when going through the JLPT listening section for level N2 and N1. That was really difficult, and not only because the exam itself is difficult for each level, it was also because I hadn't done enough of listening practice. And then there were times during which I was doing too much listening immersion practice. So for instance, recently with Mandarin Chinese, I realized that at some point my study routine was focusing too much on listening practice, of which I couldn't make much sense, especially at the beginning, and not enough on actively studying the language, which was impacting my whole understanding of the language. So, I had the reverse issue then. So I reintroduced a bit more active studying and textbook study and, grammar study, prompt questions, that kind of thing, into my study routine to rebalance everything. Fourth mistake I made was in trying to adopt the same approach whenever I did listening immersion practice. That's a big one. By that, I mean that I tried a lot of methods with my listening immersion practice. With English, it was entirely different, because essentially my study routine with English was mainly consisting of listening immersion practice, during which I didn't do anything, in the sense that I was simply focused on what I was watching or listening to, and I wasn't doing anything. I was just focused on the material. whatever it was. TV show, movie, video game, YouTube video, vlog, whatever, you name it. But when I started doing it for Japanese, I started naturally to develop a new approach for my listening immersion practice. And so, for example, I would have my Yomiwa app opened on my phone and I would look up the words that I'd heard and that I didn't understand. I would then write down those words in vocab study lists that I would then go back to later. Then I would also have sessions during which I just focused on the material without looking anything up. I would watch TV shows in Japanese with English subtitles or Japanese subtitles or without any of those. At some point, I also went through some audio material, podcasts specifically, and I was trying to transcribe them entirely to make sure that I understood things properly, and then I would correct them. And what I'm trying to say here is that with listening immersion practice, I essentially tried out every possible method that you can apply to the routine. And whenever I had come up with a new method that I wanted to try out or apply to my listening practice, especially with Japanese, I would just then, be very rigid about it and apply it all of the time. However, the problem arose when I was unable to do relaxed listening immersion practice in Japanese. So I was thinking in this kind of weird way, by which I wasn't allowing myself to do listening practice without looking up the words that I didn't know and then writing them down in my notebook. Do you see where I'm getting at? With listening immersion practice, I was just restricting myself to this way of doing it. Only this way of doing it, which was a huge mistake because there was absolutely no reason for me to contrive all of my listening immersion practice to this method only, yet I did it. I put pressure on myself to do it this way, and in the end, I think it definitely impacted, once again, the way I approached the language. Once I'd realized this, I stopped being so rigid about it. I just stopped doing it altogether and I started having a way more flexible approach towards listening practice. And nowadays, for all of my languages, within a given week, I will do listening practice multiple times, and there may be one time during the week when I look up the words that I don't know and then write them down. Then, another time during the week, I may watch a TV show and not have subtitles on, not look up the words that I don't know, not writing anything down, and be entirely focused on the show and just enjoy it. And then maybe another day during the week, I would listen to something in my target language and then try and do shadowing, which I wasn't doing the previous 2 times. It's okay to approach listening immersion practice using different methods that you balance between themselves depending on what you're prepared to do, the tools you have, and your skills, of course, because when you're a complete beginner, even if you wanted to extract the words that you don't know and then note them down, it would be extremely difficult. And finally, the 5th mistake with my listening immersion practice was to not be careful enough about the amount of scripted speech I would listen to versus the unscripted speech I would listen to. So really the scripted versus unscripted balance there. This is a trap that I fell into, definitely with English, because at the time I was doing listening immersion practice, consciously, I was essentially watching every single movie and TV show I could get my hands on, which is good in and of itself. It's just that when you're trying to learn a language, it's not good enough. You need to balance it with natural speech, which is not scripted. So I'm talking vlogs, documentaries where they interview people on the street, or TV shows where they interview people on the street, native speakers, of course. That's crucial. Again, I bitterly regretted not having done that with English when I had my first proper interactions with native speakers, because I was unable to understand really what they were saying, even though I was watching TV shows and movies in English. Doesn't it seem like a bit of a contradiction? And so this is a mistake that I could have avoided for my English, but which I avoided later for my Japanese. So thankfully, I made it with English so that I could correct it later with my studying of other languages. And so with that, we're gonna be concluding today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was insightful. Do let me know in the comment section what your past mistakes have been. I can't wait to read all of these. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one on the channel. それではまた次の動画でお会いしましょう。バイバイ。またね。
'Cause tonight I'm gonna take you out.